Socrates once stated that we should follow the argument wherever it leads.
A good argument needs to check two boxes, the first being validity. Validity refers only to the structure of the argument, in the sense that an argument is made of premises with a conclusion that draws only from the information that they provide. An example of an argument that's valid in structure might be premise 1, all animals with 4 legs are dogs, premise 2, Max has 4 legs, conclusion Max is a dog. Even though the conclusion draws only from the information provided, you can see exactly what's gone wrong here. This leads immediately to the second necessity of a good argument. It must have soundness. What this means is the premises an argument presented must be factual and accurate. Premise 1, dogs cannot breathe underwater. Premise 2, Max is a dog. Conclusion, Max cannot breathe underwater. This conclusion follows from the information presented in the premises, and the premises are demonstrably true, making this a logical argument. Logical fallacies regard only the validity of an argument, not its soundness. Logical fallacies are oversights in reasoning, which when used to construct an argument make it fallacious or unable to be used to prove a conclusion.
When we look at the most profound question of life, does God exist? We should certainly follow His advice. When we do, we'll find evidences.
As a brief aside, the only people that I ever hear use the word evidences in lieu of the word evidence are creationists.
That show us God is real. Let's look at 6 proofs that show God exists. Number 1, the universe must have a cause. The most fundamental law of science is the law of cause and effect. And it says that for every material effect we see, there is a cause that came before it or was simultaneous to it, and that is greater than it.
I think what Kyle might be referring to here is the law of causality, which states every action has a corresponding consequence. Adding the word material to effect is a meaningless distinction because science only cares about what's empirical. Things that are immaterial are unverifiable and falsifiable, and science has nothing to say about them.
The universe is a material effect. So what caused the universe? You see, if you don't believe in a creator, then you have to suggest something like a singularity. That's what is popular today, that there was some type of singularity that exploded in something called the Big Bang. But then when you try to get down to the bottom of what's a singularity, well, what we hear from the scientific community that suggests to us, the cosmologists, they say, well, a singularity was something that popped into existence from nothing.
Well, since we've never observed nothing, we do not in fact know what can or cannot come from it. Possibility must be demonstrated, either positively or negatively. The correct answer would be, we don't know if something can come from nothing, but even this is completely irrelevant. The Big Bang model does not posit that something can come from nothing, or that something came from nothing, but rather the expanse of the universe when walked back leads to a point in space of very high density and temperature.
Do you know that if there ever were a time when there was nothing, that's exactly what we would have now? The idea that something popped into existence from nothing is simply not a scientific idea.
I appreciate that Kyle acknowledges that things that don't follow the laws of nature are unscientific.
You see, they're suggesting that that singularity is somehow natural, but it behaves supernaturally. They say that that singularity wouldn't have followed the laws of nature. Well then, so what are we left with? We're left with the fact that the universe had a beginning, and it was not a natural cause. It was something above nature. It was something super nature.
I'll grant for the sake of simplicity that the universe is a physical thing that likely arose from somewhere. The fact that science does not have a definitive answer outside the bounds of the Big Bang does not mean that the cause was supernatural. This is an argument from ignorance, or I don't know how else it could have happened, so it must be God. It's not an explanation for anything.
Something supernatural. And so when we see the material effect of the universe, we can know that there was a supernatural creator that caused the universe.
He's trying to argue that the universe must have a cause. Premise 1, the universe is an effect. Premise 2, effects must have a cause. Premise 3, something cannot come from nothing, so therefore there was a supernatural creator that created the universe. This is a good example of the composition fallacy. What he's trying to argue essentially is that because things can't come from nothing, therefore the universe can't come from nothing. This is kind of like saying that because a car is made of components that are lightweight, therefore the car must be lightweight. There's no reason to assume that what's true of the parts is also true of the whole.
Proof number 2. Design demands a designer. It is a truism that everybody recognizes that this universe looks designed. In fact, when we see the various different aspects of nature, and we see birds and squirrels and trees, and we see all of the things that they do so well, many times we as humans, we try to copy and mimic that design, but often we don't do nearly as well as the design that we see in nature.
In what way can we not make things better than nature? We can make a camera that can see thousands of times the resolution of the human eye. We can make airplanes that can fly faster than any bird, and so on.
We look at the design of the human body and the human hand and the arm and the leg and the brain, and we see that those are some of the most advanced, technologically savvy pieces of equipment ever put together, and we try to mimic them and copy them, and we can't do it as well. Why? Because this universe exhibits design from the starry sky at night to the fingertips on your hand. The design is overwhelming. It's everywhere. Where does design originate? Well, what you and I both know is that when you see things that function and they're complex, that design comes from an intelligent designer.
Complexity is not diagnostic of design. A hallmark of good design, in my mind, is something that has an efficient simplicity, which is not the kind of systems that we see in nature.
Big explosions just simply don't bring about order. They don't cause things that are functional and complex to come into existence. The design we see in the universe demands a supernatural, intelligent designer.
Even if you could prove that things in nature were intelligently designed, that doesn't get you to a supernatural, all-powerful designer. That's a non sequitur. So taking a look at his second argument, it's premise 1, complexity only comes from intelligent design. Premise 2, the universe appears complex, so conclusion, it was therefore intelligently designed. This is a false dichotomy. God did it, or it created itself out of nothing, are not the only two options. What you should ask is, God did it, or God didn't do it, because this is a true dichotomy, because it's a logical negation. He's also begging the question by assuming that complexity only comes from intelligent design in the first place.
Proof number 3. Life demands a supernatural life giver. You see, in the material world, we have come to understand that there is a law of biology called the law of biogenesis. Law of biogenesis simply says this, that in this material, natural world, life comes from previously existing life of its own kind.
I seriously doubt that this law of biogenesis that Kyle is referring to is a fundamental law of science. I looked in quotes for the description of this law on Google, and I was only able to find it listed on 3 websites, and all of them are very much creationism-centric.
Now, when we look at how people used to think about life, they said, no, life can arise spontaneously from non-living chemicals. And yet every single biological experiment has shown us that that simply is biologically impossible. Life doesn't arise from non-living chemicals.
Science hasn't actually demonstrated that it's impossible. I think the most you could say is right now they have not demonstrated that it's possible, but those are 2 very different claims. I think Kyle is just wrong in this regard.
From where did life arise? Where did life originate if it doesn't arise from non-living chemicals? You see, the idea that there's no God suggests to us that there had to be some singularity without a cause that exploded, and that explosion brought about design, which we've never, ever seen happen. And then ultimately, somewhere the non-living chemicals gave rise to life. But that's biologically impossible. Life demands a supernatural creator.
So, in short, his argument here is premise 1, life only comes from life, and premise 2, life coming from non-living chemicals is impossible. So the conclusion is basically, what else could it have been other than God? This on its own is just a big fat argument from ignorance. It's, I don't know what else it could have been, therefore it must be what I assume that it is.
Proof number 4. Moral law demands a moral law giver. If some things are objectively morally right and other things are objectively morally wrong, then there must be a God.
Things are not, in fact, objectively moral or immoral. Morality is a value judgment based on what we value in regard to the well-being of others, which is ultimately subjective. If we agree on a moral goal, then we can determine objective ways of reaching that goal.
You see, if we evolved from primordial slime over multiplied millions of years, at what point did objective moral values arise? We don't look at a dog and say that that dog objectively, morally violated some rule when he steals a bone from another dog. We don't say, hey, he violated a objective moral value. We just don't say that.
You're right. This is because if morality was objective, then a dog doing something morally wrong would be objectively wrong. The reason we don't is precisely because we subjectively determine that a dog is not able to be held morally accountable, and thus the thing it did cannot be objectively immoral.
But we do say that humans can perpetrate things that are objectively morally wrong, that humans can be involved in things that are morally right. If that's true, there must be a God.
So here's a look at his argument. Premise 1, if things are objectively morally right or wrong, there must be a God. Premise 2, things are objectively morally right and wrong, so conclusion is there must be a God. The issue here is that he's assuming that if morality is objective, there must be a God to impose that. This is a fallacy of affirming the consequent. It's like saying, if something is wet, there must have been rain to rain onto it. It is wet, so therefore it's raining.
Proof number 5, free will exists. The atheistic idea that there is no God is founded on the idea of materialism, the idea that this material world is all that there is, all that there was, and all that there ever will be.
This is not an atheistic idea. There's also no reason to assume that there's anything outside of the natural world until it can be demonstrated.
Because of that, atheism has to suggest.
It doesn't have to suggest anything. Atheism is only a response to a single claim, the God exists claim. If your answer is anything other than, yes, I believe it, then you are by definition an atheist.
That you as a person don't really have free will, that there is no being inside of your body.
That brain is sideways.
Or brain that is supermatter. That really what's going on in your brain is just electrons bouncing around, and you're the product of those bounces, and you don't really make decisions on your own. It's just the physical laws and properties going on in your brain. If you are watching this video of your own volition, then the fact of the matter is there has to be a God that can account for that free will that you as a person have. There has to be a God if there is free will.
So taking a look at his argument here, it seems to be premise 1, there has to be a God if there's free will. Premise 2, free will exists, so in conclusion, there has to be a God. He's literally begging the question because the thing that he's trying to prove is one of the premises of his argument. That makes his argument circular and therefore fallacious.
And proof number 6, human reasoning. You see, we reason on a regular basis. We understand abstract ideas. If we were products of blind, chance, random processes over multiplied millions of years, reasoning and the laws of reasoning simply would have no explanation.
Things following a chain of causality does not make it blind chance.
And yet we reason together on a regular basis. From where does reason arise? It's got no naturalistic, atheistic explanation.
Atheism has nothing to say about explanations. It's just taking a non-positive stance on the existence of God.
Antony Flew, the atheist who wrote Theology and Falsification, the most popular atheistic paper for the last 100 years, the last century. In 2006, he co-wrote a book titled There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Became a Believer.
I wouldn't care if Darwin himself told me that God was real and evolution was all a myth and the earth is 6,000 years old and there was a worldwide flood or whatever. The identity of the person making the claim has no bearing whatsoever on the truth of it. Even smart people can say dumb things, and even a broken clock is right twice a day.
He stated that his rule of life had always been to follow the evidence where it leads. And he said he followed that evidence. And it led him to the conclusion that there is a supernatural, intelligent God.
So, in summary, I think his argument here is humans can reason. Premise 2, reason cannot come about naturally. So, in conclusion, human reasoning was created by a supernatural, intelligent God. I don't know how he's getting to that conclusion based on humans can reason and it couldn't have happened naturally, except just a giant argument from ignorance. I don't know how else this could have happened, therefore it was God.
Let's let the evidence lead us to that same conclusion.
I thought that you were going to be providing the evidence.